There's a quiet misunderstanding that often happens in relationships with avoidant personalities. They believe that silence means innocence. They assume that if you don't question them, if you don't challenge every inconsistency, if you don't demand explanations, then you must not see what's happening. In their mind, a lack of confrontation equals a lack of awareness. But what they eventually realize, often much later, is that silence is not the same thing as ignorance. Your silence had a very different purpose. You weren't silent because you didn't understand. You were silent because you were observing. Human behavior always reveals itself over time. Words can be crafted carefully. Promises can be shaped to sound convincing. But actions, real, repeated actions, tell the deeper story. And instead of reacting to every moment, every mixed signal, every sudden withdrawal, you allowed the pattern to unfold. You watched. This is something psychologically powerful. Most people react quickly when they feel uncertainty. They push for clarity. They demand reassurance. They try to solve the discomfort immediately. But when someone chooses observation instead of reaction, something very different happens. They begin to see the truth of a person's behavior without interference. Think about how avoidant dynamics usually play out. In the beginning, there's closeness. The connection feels real, sometimes even intense. Then, slowly, distance appears. Messages become shorter. Plans become less certain. Emotional availability starts to shrink. When questioned, explanations come easily. I'm just busy. I need space. It's not about you. And many people argue at that point. They confront. They chase clarity. But you did something different. You watched. You noticed the timing of their distance. You noticed how affection appeared when they feared losing connection, and how it faded when things felt emotionally safe again. You noticed how their words tried to smooth over behavior that didn't quite match. And instead of reacting immediately, you allowed the behavior to speak for itself. There's a certain intellectual discipline in that. Because observation requires patience, it requires emotional restraint. It requires the ability to sit with uncertainty without rushing to control it. And while they thought they were managing the situation, maintaining emotional distance, protecting themselves behind subtle walls, they didn't realize that their actions were quietly forming a pattern in your mind. Every withdrawal added a piece to the puzzle. Every return added another. Eventually, something shifted. You stopped trying to interpret their words, and you started trusting what their actions consistently revealed. And once a person reaches that level of awareness, something powerful happens internally. You stop feeling confused. You stop chasing explanations. You begin to see the structure of the behavior itself. And that's the moment the avoidant often fails to notice. Because while they believe they're maintaining control through distance and ambiguity, they don't realize that someone is watching carefully enough to understand the system behind it. The silence they once interpreted as naivety was actually perception. And perception changes everything. Because the moment you truly see someone's behavioral pattern, you are no longer emotionally trapped inside it. You're observing it from a place of clarity. And when that realization finally reaches the avoidant, when they understand that you were never blind, never confused, never naive, it can be deeply unsettling. Not because you accused them, not because you fought them, but because you understood them. And few things are more confronting than realizing someone saw the truth of your actions long before you were ready to admit them yourself. Silence, in the hands of awareness, is not weakness. It is perception waiting patiently for the truth to reveal itself. Once you begin observing instead of reacting, another realization naturally follows. You start to understand a principle that psychologists, philosophers, and great thinkers have repeated for generations. People always reveal their true priorities through behavior, not language. Words are flexible. Words are strategic. Words can be shaped in the moment to calm a situation, to maintain connection, or sometimes simply to avoid discomfort. And avoidant personalities often become very skilled with language for exactly that reason. They know how to say just enough to keep the connection from collapsing, but rarely enough to fully open themselves emotionally. So you might hear things like, "I care about you. I'm just overwhelmed right now. You mean a lot to me. I just need time." On the surface, those statements sound reassuring. They create the impression of emotional depth and intention. But if you step back and look at the behavior surrounding those words, a different story sometimes begins to appear. You notice that the emotional availability comes and goes. When the connection feels threatened, When they sense distance or the possibility of losing you, suddenly there is warmth again. There are messages, attention, reassurance. The door opens. But once stability returns, something shifts again. Distance creeps back in. Communication slows. Plans become uncertain. Emotional vulnerability disappears. At first, this pattern is confusing for many people, because when you listen only to words, the story feels inconsistent. The language suggests care, but the behavior suggests hesitation. The mind tries to reconcile the two, often giving the benefit of the doubt again and again. But something changes when you begin to focus on actions instead. You start asking a very different set of questions. Not what are they saying, but what are they consistently doing? Not what do they promise, but what do their patterns reveal over time? This shift is subtle, but psychologically it is incredibly powerful. Because actions have a quality that words do not, they accumulate evidence. One moment can be explained away. 2 moments can be rationalized. But repeated patterns begin to form a structure that becomes difficult to ignore. And that's when clarity begins to replace confusion. You start noticing the rhythm of the connection. The moments when they lean in, the moments when they pull away. You see how their words often arrive after the behavior has already created uncertainty. Language becomes a tool for managing the aftermath rather than expressing genuine consistency. And instead of chasing the reassurance of their words, you begin trusting the quiet honesty of their actions. That's a turning point. Because once you trust actions over words, you stop negotiating with ambiguity. You stop trying to interpret every sentence for hidden meaning. You begin to see behavior as the most accurate form of communication. And behavior rarely lies. For the avoidant, this shift can feel unsettling. Because as long as someone listens mainly to words, there is room to maintain distance while still preserving connection. But when someone begins observing behavior closely, the margin for illusion disappears. They begin to realize that you're not responding the way you used to. You're not arguing about explanations anymore. You're not pressing for emotional declarations. You're simply watching the alignment or the misalignment between what they say and what they do. And that awareness quietly changes the dynamic. Because when someone stops reacting to promises and starts evaluating patterns, the relationship moves into a completely different psychological territory. One built on clarity rather than hope. And in that space, a powerful truth becomes impossible to ignore. Words may comfort the moment, but actions always reveal the reality. And the person who learns to read actions instead of promises will eventually see the truth of any relationship with unmistakable clarity. And once you begin seeing behavior clearly, something else starts to happen internally. Instead of immediately confronting every inconsistency, you begin choosing understanding over constant confrontation. That doesn't mean you approve of the behavior. It doesn't mean you ignore it. It means you start looking deeper, beyond the surface reactions, and into the psychology driving the pattern. Most people, when faced with emotional distance, instinctively move toward pressure. They demand answers. They want clarity right now. They want the discomfort resolved immediately. And that reaction is completely human. When connection feels uncertain, the mind tries to restore security as quickly as possible. But confrontation, especially repeated confrontation, can sometimes feed directly into the defensive structure of an avoidant personality. The more pressure they feel, the more their instinct is to retreat. The more emotional intensity enters the conversation, the more their internal alarm system activates. What they experience is not simply disagreement. It feels like emotional overwhelm. And that's where your approach became different. Instead of escalating every moment of confusion into a battle for explanation, you stepped back and allowed yourself to understand the deeper pattern. You began recognizing that their behavior wasn't always about manipulation or lack of care. Often it was about fear of vulnerability, fear of losing independence, fear of emotional exposure. Avoidant individuals develop a powerful self-protection system. Many of them learned early in life that emotional closeness comes with risk. So they build distance not because connection is meaningless to them, but because connection feels dangerously powerful. When intimacy grows, their instinct is to regain control by creating space. When you start seeing that pattern clearly, confrontation begins to lose its usefulness. Because you realize you're not arguing with a simple disagreement. You're encountering a deeply conditioned emotional defense. So instead of constantly demanding explanations, you watch. You listen. You learn. You notice when they open up and what seems to trigger the closing of those doors again. You observe the rhythm of their comfort with closeness. You start recognizing the moments when vulnerability appears and the moments when fear quietly pushes it away. This doesn't mean you excuse unhealthy behavior. It simply means you stop trying to force awareness into someone who isn't ready to face it yet. And that level of restraint requires maturity. Because the ego often wants to prove a point. It wants to win the argument. It wants to expose the contradiction immediately. But deeper understanding is not about winning arguments. It's about seeing reality as it actually is. And ironically, this calm awareness can be far more confronting for the avoidant than emotional conflict ever was. Because arguments allow them to defend themselves. Arguments create noise. They create distraction. They give the mind something to fight against. But quiet observation removes that shield. When you stop chasing explanations and simply see the pattern for what it is, your presence becomes different. There's less urgency, less pressure, less emotional chaos. And in that calm space, something subtle but powerful happens. They begin to feel seen. Not attacked, not judged, seen. And being seen can be one of the most uncomfortable experiences for someone who has spent years hiding behind emotional distance. Because now their behavior isn't being argued about, it's being understood. And understanding removes the illusion that their defenses are invisible. That's the paradox of this dynamic. By choosing understanding over constant confrontation, you didn't become weaker in the relationship. You became clearer. And clarity carries a quiet authority that arguments never can. Because when you truly understand the pattern behind someone's behavior, you no longer need to fight it to know the truth. And the person who sees the pattern clearly is no longer controlled by it. When you stop reacting to every moment and begin observing with patience, time starts to reveal something powerful. Patterns that once felt confusing begin to organize themselves. What once seemed like random behavior slowly starts forming a clear and undeniable structure. And this is where patience becomes one of the most powerful psychological tools a person can possess. Most people underestimate the power of time in human behavior. They believe clarity must come from immediate conversations, from intense emotional discussions, from forcing answers in the moment. But human psychology rarely reveals itself instantly. True behavioral patterns only become visible when someone is willing to step back and allow them to unfold naturally. And that's exactly what patience allows. At first, the avoidant may believe they are managing the dynamic perfectly. They lean in when they want closeness. They pull away when vulnerability feels too strong. They return when the distance begins to threaten the connection. From their perspective, this rhythm gives them control. They believe they are carefully balancing intimacy and independence. But what they often fail to realize is that repeated behavior creates predictability. And predictability exposes patterns. When someone watches patiently enough, the cycle becomes visible. The closeness, the retreat, the explanation, the return, it begins to look less like isolated moments and more like a repeating system. What once felt personal starts to look structural. And once a pattern becomes visible, the emotional confusion begins to fade. You start seeing the sequence before it fully happens. You recognize the signals of withdrawal before the distance even becomes obvious. You notice the familiar moments when warmth returns again. And with each cycle, your awareness grows sharper. This is something avoidant personalities rarely expect, because much of their behavior operates beneath conscious awareness. They often believe their reactions are spontaneous, situational, or justified by external circumstances. They may not fully recognize how consistent their responses actually are. But patience exposes consistency. While they believed you were simply waiting, hoping, or trying to understand them, something very different was happening. You were learning the rhythm of their behavior. Each moment added another piece to the pattern. And slowly, your emotional dependence on their responses began to change. The same actions that once created confusion started creating clarity instead. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening?" you began recognizing, "This is the pattern." That shift is incredibly powerful. Because once a pattern is visible, it loses much of its emotional power over you. Surprise disappears. Confusion fades. You're no longer trying to interpret every moment. You're seeing the structure behind it. And something even more unexpected begins to happen. The avoidant starts noticing that you're responding differently. You're calmer, less reactive, less desperate for immediate reassurance. The dynamic they were used to controlling starts to feel unfamiliar, because the person who once reacted emotionally is now observing with awareness. And that's when the deeper realization begins to form for them. The cycles they believed were invisible are no longer hidden. The behaviors they thought were subtle are now understood. The rhythm they used to maintain distance has quietly become predictable. In many ways, patience turns behavior into evidence. And evidence changes everything. Because once someone sees the pattern clearly enough, they stop being trapped inside it. They're no longer chasing explanations. They're no longer reacting to each individual moment. They're watching the system itself. And the moment you begin seeing the system behind someone's behavior, you step into a completely different level of awareness. Because time has revealed what emotion alone could never fully explain. And patience has done something confrontation never could. It has turned confusion into clarity. Once clarity replaces confusion, another transformation begins to take place. Your reactions start to change. And this shift, though subtle at first, can completely alter the psychological dynamic between you and the avoidant. For a long time, the rhythm of the relationship may have been built around reaction. When they pulled away, you felt it immediately. When their messages slowed down, uncertainty appeared. When distance entered the connection, it created emotional turbulence. And those reactions, very human reactions, often kept the cycle alive. Because reactions provide feedback. Every time someone withdraws and sees a strong emotional response on the other side, it confirms something for them. It confirms their importance. It confirms their influence over the emotional atmosphere of the relationship. Even if they're not consciously trying to control anything, the dynamic still places them at the center of the emotional system. But something remarkable happens when you stop reacting the way you used to. It's not that you become cold or indifferent. It's that you become grounded. The awareness you've developed through observation, patience, and understanding begins to stabilize your emotions. Instead of immediately responding to every shift in their behavior, you start allowing space. You let their actions stand on their own without rushing to fill the silence with explanations or demands. And that quiet space can be profoundly unsettling for an avoidant. Because reactions are predictable, reactions are familiar. They create noise, emotion, arguments, reassurance, something the mind can engage with. But calm awareness creates something entirely different. It creates reflection. When there is no immediate emotional storm to distract from their behavior, the avoidant is left alone with their own actions. There's no argument to win, no accusation to defend against, no emotional chaos to escape from. Just silence. And in that silence, something unusual begins to happen. They start noticing the shift in you. The person who once reacted quickly is now composed. The person who once searched for reassurance is now quietly observing. The emotional energy that used to chase them is no longer present in the same way. That change can trigger curiosity first. They may begin wondering what happened, why the dynamic feels different, why the emotional gravity they were used to is no longer pulling the same way. And curiosity often leads to reflection. Without dramatic reactions to focus on, their attention slowly turns inward. They start replaying interactions. They begin thinking about their own behavior in ways they may have avoided before. The distance they created no longer produces the same predictable response, and that disruption forces the mind to reconsider what's really happening. In psychology, awareness often begins not through confrontation, but through disruption of expectation. And your calm presence disrupts the pattern they understood. The avoidant suddenly faces something unfamiliar. A person who sees the pattern but refuses to be emotionally controlled by it. Someone who isn't trying to force closeness, yet isn't blindly accepting distance either. Someone who simply sees. And being seen without emotional chaos removes their usual defenses. Because arguments allow people to protect themselves, conflict allows them to redirect blame. But quiet awareness offers no such escape. It simply reflects reality. And reality has a way of inviting reflection, even in people who have spent years avoiding it. That's why this stage of the dynamic is so powerful. Your lack of impulsive reaction doesn't weaken your position, it strengthens it. It removes the emotional leverage that once sustained the cycle. Instead of feeding the pattern, you begin exposing it. And when someone finally starts reflecting on their own behavior, not because they were forced to, but because the silence left them no distractions, that is the moment true awareness has a chance to begin. Because sometimes the most powerful mirror you can offer another person is not confrontation. It is calm, unshakable awareness. And eventually, after enough time, observation, and quiet shifts in the dynamic, the final realization begins to surface. It doesn't usually arrive dramatically. There's rarely a single moment where everything is suddenly spoken out loud. Instead, it appears gradually, almost quietly. The avoidant begins to understand something they hadn't fully recognized before. You were never naive. For a long time, they may have believed that your patience meant innocence. They may have assumed that your silence meant you didn't fully grasp what was happening. From their perspective, the absence of confrontation suggested that you were simply trusting their words at face value. But slowly, as your behavior changed, that assumption began to collapse. They noticed the calmness in your reactions. They noticed how you no longer chased explanations the way you once did. They noticed how their familiar patterns, pulling away, returning, offering reassurance, no longer created the same emotional effect. And that's when the deeper realization starts forming. You weren't blind to the pattern. You were watching it. The silence they once interpreted as naivety was actually awareness. The patience they mistook for confusion was actually observation. You saw the cycles, the distancing, the careful use of words to soften actions that didn't quite align. But instead of exposing every inconsistency immediately, you allowed time to reveal the full picture. And when someone finally realizes they've been understood at that level, it can be deeply confronting, because it means the narrative they believed about the situation was incomplete. They believed they were managing the emotional distance quietly, maintaining control over how much of themselves they revealed. What they didn't realize is that someone was paying attention closely enough to see through the system. This realization often arrives with a strange mixture of emotions for the avoidant. There can be admiration, because awareness like that requires emotional maturity. There can be discomfort, because being understood removes the illusion that their defenses were invisible. And sometimes, there can even be regret, because by the time this awareness fully reaches them, the dynamic has already changed. You're no longer standing in the same place emotionally. The clarity you gained through observation has reshaped your relationship with the situation. When someone truly sees a pattern, they begin protecting their own peace differently. They stop investing endless emotional energy trying to decode behavior that has already revealed its structure. They stop chasing clarity from someone whose actions have already provided it. And this is the part that avoidants often realize too late. They begin to see that the person they once thought was simply patient was actually perceptive. The person they believed was waiting for reassurance was actually gathering understanding. The person they assumed needed their validation had already begun building internal clarity. And that clarity quietly shifts the power of the entire relationship. Because awareness brings freedom. Once you fully understand a pattern, you are no longer controlled by it. You can choose distance. You can choose boundaries. You can choose peace over emotional confusion. And in many cases, by the time the avoidant recognizes how deeply you understood their behavior, you've already stepped into a different level of emotional independence. Not with anger, not with resentment, with clarity. The greatest irony in all of this is that the very patience they once misinterpreted becomes the reason they finally see the truth. You weren't naive. You were paying attention. And by the time they realized that, you had already learned the most important lesson the experience could offer. The person who truly understands someone's actions no longer needs their explanations. As we step back and look at the entire journey, something powerful becomes clear. This was never really a story about proving someone wrong. It was never about winning an argument, exposing contradictions, or forcing another person to finally admit what they were doing. It was about awareness. When you first entered the dynamic, like many people do, you probably believed connection alone would create clarity. You trusted the words, you trusted the moments of closeness, and when confusion appeared, you tried to understand it through conversation and patience. That's a natural human response. We want relationships to make sense. But over time, something deeper began to develop within you. You started observing instead of reacting. You started paying attention to patterns instead of promises. You began choosing understanding instead of constant confrontation. And through patience, the The structure of the behavior slowly revealed itself. This is where true emotional intelligence begins. Because emotional intelligence is not simply about expressing feelings. It's about recognizing patterns in human behavior. It's about understanding that people communicate far more through their actions than through their words. And once you learn to read those patterns clearly, confusion loses its grip on you. The avoidant may have believed your silence meant innocence. They may have thought your patience meant you didn't fully see what was happening. But what they eventually realized, often much later, is that your silence was awareness. You were watching, learning, and understanding the rhythm of their behavior long before they realized it. And that awareness changed you. Not in a bitter way, not in a way that hardened your heart, but in a way that strengthened your clarity. You no longer needed endless explanations because actions had already spoken. You no longer needed to chase reassurance because the patterns had already told the story. And that is one of the most powerful transformations a person can experience in relationships. When you stop trying to control another person's behavior and start understanding it, you reclaim something incredibly valuable, your peace of mind. Because the truth is this: you cannot force someone to face their fears, open their heart, or break the defenses they built long before you arrived in their life. That is a journey they must choose for themselves. But what you can do is learn. You can observe. You can grow. You can develop the kind of awareness that allows you to see reality clearly instead of chasing illusions. And when someone finally realizes that you were never naive, that you were simply watching their actions quietly, the dynamic changes forever. Not because you tried to control them, but because you finally understood them. And the moment you truly understand someone's behavior, you gain the freedom to decide what role, if any, they deserve in your life. So the real lesson here is not about avoidance. It's about awareness. Because the person who learns to observe actions, recognize patterns, and trust clarity over confusion becomes someone who can never again be easily misled. And that kind of awareness is not just wisdom. It is power.